artwork that is not related to tonight's presentation, but I recommend you take a look at it or come back later this week. Tonight, I am very pleased to welcome for the third time Ms. Catherine Anderson. She's the author of many volumes on the history of institutions and mental health treatment, and she has been in special education for over 20 years and is the president of the Danvers State School Friends Association, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the history of state institution and disability rights. She has a wonderful, wonderful overview here of the Castle on the Hill. In its heyday, it was state-of-the-art, and the community embraced it, and it was a wonderful relationship for so many years, and then there were changes, as we're aware. So I welcome Catherine, and I welcome all of you. Again, we're just so fortunate that Catherine made the trip again. So let's give her a warm.
So hello everyone, as Laura said, I am Kate Anderson and I am an institutional historian. I've been in special ed for 22 years. I specialize in working with students with mental health issues and also with developmental disabilities. I've written books about Danvers, Westboro State Hospital, Worcester State Hospital, Belchertown State School, and as Laura also said, I'm the president of the Belchertown State School Friends Association. We are a group that managed to save one of the remaining buildings of the Belchertown State School, and it's going to become a museum to institutional history. So it will cover everything from state schools to state hospitals to reform schools, truant schools, everything that ever contributed to how we view mental health care and special education and disability rights today. But today specifically, since we are in Danvers, right? We're in Danvers? Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Danvers State Hospital, also known as the Castle on the Hill. This is a beautiful front paper from one of the original annual reports back when Danvers State Hospital was called the State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers. Obviously, and you'll hear me use different language throughout this presentation, the words that we use to discuss mental health, special education, disabilities has changed drastically over time. So, this title, State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers, of course today, no one would call a hospital that, I hope. I hope no one would call a hospital that, but you never know. However, it is still historical language and it's still important to telling the story of how these places evolved. So you will hear some of the historically appropriate language, so please don't cringe. I have to always give that disclaimer. Next slide, please. So, at one time, the United States did not have any place for the care of the mentally ill or disabled whatsoever. In fact, we didn't even have general hospitals. All medical care was taken care of at home. It took a very long time for the United States, such as we were at the time, because we were actually just a few colonies, kind of hanging out the border. Massachusetts was one of the first states to decide that we really needed a general hospital, first of all, but more importantly, we needed a hospital to care for folks who were not necessarily typical. We had a great model to follow, Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. He was the superintendent of Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, which is this beautiful place here. And this was from about 1840. And in 1844, he founded what was eventually going to become the American Psychiatric Association. It was originally called the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane. Thank goodness they shortened it to the American Psychiatric Association. Because that's a mouthful, and I don't think anybody would be able to continue that. So Kirkbride believed firmly that the foundation of mental health care had to be in what he called moral treatment. This was practice that came from England and caught on very quickly in the United States. And this was the assumption that anyone who was mentally ill, experiencing any kind of mental illness, needed to be removed from where they were and placed in an environment that was beautiful, that was conducive to treatment, and where they could get out and get fresh air. It's the reason why so many of these hospitals were built on the top of hills, because they were meant to get patients away from the ills of society and the hustle and bustle of the city. And Kirkbride's Pennsylvania Hospital became a prime example. Next slide, please. So, Kirkbride decided to take it one step further. Not only did they need fresh air and a really great place for the hospital, but it had to look a certain way too. So this is the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum, and you can see that the hospital has a very particular shape to it, and it looks like a bat with its wings outstretched. We call it the Kirkbride bat wing. So, in 1854, this particular floor plan was published. Kirkbride said, listen, we've got to have this set up where we have the main administration building in the middle of that body. And then as the wards started to stretch out from the main administration building, they would each kind of step back a little bit and get a little further away, further back, further away. That way, we could take care of patients by classes. We could look at patients and look at their diagnoses and their prognosis, whether or not they could be cured, how quickly they could move out of the hospital, could they have visitors, could they hold a job, and we could set up the hospital so that the patients who couldn't be cured, patients who had things like schizophrenia, patients who were violent, they would be at the farthest tip of the bat wing, where they could be cared for, separate from those patients who perhaps were there because they had an anxiety disorder or chronic depression, things that back then you could come in, spend some time in the hospital, get some skills, and go back out. You could have a job, you could have visitors, you were going out on the farm. And in the early days of places like Danvers State Hospital, all of the wards were unlocked. You could pass through all of the wards as a patient with a lot of freedom. So, this plan became kind of the gold standard for asylums, especially here in Massachusetts. We have quite a few. We were kind of the land of the Kirkbride, if you will. Next slide, please. So here is the actual floor plan for, the original floor plan for Danvers State Hospital, which was designed by Nathaniel J. Bradley. Each Kirkbride asylum had its own architect that put his own spin, and I say his because they were all men who designed these hospitals. They put their own spin on the Kirkbride plan. If you take a look at the outer tip of this particular hospital, A ward is kind of cocked a little bit, and there's a little circle that joins B and A ward. Those were towers that also served as ventilation towers, but they were also decorative, and it's the only hospital of its kind that has those, and also has those kickbacking wards. There is footage somewhere, I don't know if it's footage or if it's still footage, of those particular wards actually just standing by themselves once demolition started, and it's kind of cool to see those angled wards all by themselves. When I say cool, in that's really sad because it got torn down kind of way. So Bradley designed this in 1874, and the hospital opened officially in 1878. Next slide, please. So this is probably one of the most iconic photographs of Danvers. It's an aerial of the hospital in the 90s, long before demolition. But the one thing that you'll notice is that if you look at the main administration building, the cupola is missing. It's just a flat, white, I'm not even sure what they put, just the same roof as down here. But it's just a flat white. The cupola had been removed and taken to the dump, believe it or not. Yes. Next slide, please. So, this is a very early plot plan for Danvers, and it was built on 198 acres of land, which most of the asylums in Massachusetts were built on huge tracts of land. Northampton State Hospital, same thing. Belchertown State School, close to 900 acres. So these campuses were massive, and they were meant to be self-sufficient. So the acreage included farmland. They raised all of their own animals for slaughter. Most of the hospitals had apiaries so they could have honey. Some of them they all raised chickens, some of them raised turkeys. And in some places, Danvers did have a prize-winning dairy herd, believe it or not, as did Belchertown, Northampton, and Munson, so it was kind of a cool, when you look back in the records, like I do, because it's a rabbit hole of research to go down, you can see all of the institutions trading livestock, trading farm machinery, providing food for each other, providing milk to one another, butter, cheese, things like that. And they kept each other going, they sustained each other for a very, very long time. In some cases, most of these hospitals could operate for years without any kind of outside funding, whether it be state or federal, in the early days. So Danvers was not the first hospital in Massachusetts, as some people do believe. It's actually the fourth. And it was built so that it would relieve overcrowding in Worcester, Taunton, and Northampton, because we had gotten to the point in the late 1800s where we were finally trying to figure out how to best care for people with disabilities. And in the early days, when the state hospitals were the only thing that existed, people with all kinds of disabilities were in these hospitals. It wasn't just folks with mental illness, it was folks with cerebral palsy, folks with Down syndrome, folks who had come to this country and didn't speak English. So, that was a very real problem. So these institutions filled up very quickly. And also, as society changed and the way the nuclear family operated also changed, once families figured out that we didn't have to keep our relatives in the attic any longer, we had a place for them to go, again, they filled up very quickly. And so Danvers was built to alleviate some of that overcrowding. Typical Kirkbride hospitals were built to only hold 250 patients. So once Northampton State Hospital and Taunton filled up, and in some cases Worcester, they kind of jockeyed them in like sardines really quickly. Taunton and Northampton were a little slower to overcrowd, but at a capacity of 250 people, it gets overcrowded really quickly, and so Danvers was necessary. Next slide, please. This is actually one of the wards at Danvers. This picture is probably circa 1930s. You can see how beautiful the architecture of the wards were. This is one of the open wards. This would not have been typical because most of the Kirkbrides had private rooms, but this is most likely the large floor-to-ceiling windows probably opened. This is probably for tuberculosis patients, which was a big thing in the 30s and 40s for asylums. They took in a lot of tuberculosis patients. And you can see that. Go ahead. No, go right ahead.
The land that they bought, I heard that before. Did you get tuberculosis hospital prior to the state hospital?
No, the land that Danvers State Hospital is on was private land. It belonged to one of the Salem witch trial judges. It is Hathorne Hill. So they actually took the door knocker off of his mansion and it went on the nurse's house for a while, onto Grey Gables. But that is Hathorne Hill, and legend has it that one of the hanging trees from the Salem witch trials was up there. I don't know if they left it, but yeah, it could actually be A, yes. If you haven't gotten a chance to look at the blueprints that are up here, this is a 1936 layout of the entire Kirkbride, and you can see how the wards were laid out and how they were lettered. And it's a really interesting way to actually look down and look at the hospital itself. Next slide, please. So, one of the things that was exceptionally unique about Danvers is that it attracted close to 12,000 visitors per year. Part of that was because they had these beautiful gardens, and they were actually public gardens, believe it or not. This photo, I don't have a year on this photo, but this was late 1800s, and there were four gardens that there were four garden patches that each had a point of the compass, and they had sundials, and each of the gardens, the flowers formed a theme. They were absolutely incredible. And anytime that visitors came, they were also allowed to visit the patients. So they would bring baskets of baked goods for the patients, they would bring books, They would bring games, and sometimes they would have picnics with the patients. And they would spend the whole day there. That was a Sunday outing, was going and visiting Danvers State Hospital. These gardens were maintained for many, many years, and they were probably one of the most talked about attractions at Danvers, believe it or not. And then, so I think this is the garden that's the scroll. Then there was the compass points, and there was one that was a sundial. The flowers all made a different shape. Next slide. When Danvers first opened, it was a model of mental health treatment. All of the state hospitals in Massachusetts were. We were ahead of the curve. We were the leader in mental health treatment. And the state hospitals instituted a lot of practices that didn't exist anywhere else yet. One of those was occupational therapy. So you can see patients here exercising out in the yard, and then the patients on the left are most likely doing some sort of arts and crafts type activity to get their fine motor skills going, to get their thinking skills. They played a lot of games and spent a lot of time doing things like social skills, turn taking, how to converse with one another. And in many cases, those were skills that folks were coming into the hospital severely lacking. And the whole purpose of these hospitals was to fill in skill gaps, support the people coming in, get them some coping skills, and then send them back home so that they could go back out and be contributing members of society. So these were common occurrences at Danvers.
Actually, this, can I point something out?
Yeah.
This photograph here on the right is actually taken either a J or A word. You can see the appendix there
Yeah.
on the left side pointing out
Yeah.
one of the ends of the hospital.
Yeah. And it formed nice little courtyards so that they could go out and exercise. Next slide. So after the patients did their occupational therapy and did their arts and crafts, they would have either little sales or they would have events where the items that they made would get shared with the public. So they had a helping hand cart, which was gifts for the poor, articles that could be sold to raise money, and other opportunities for them to connect with people from the town, and also other patients' families that would come to visit. And I love those two pictures. I especially love the outfit of the mannequin. Next slide, please. So a lot of what you're going to see is a collection of photos that are actual items that still exist. They are in a private collection, but these are items that came directly out of the asylum. When patients came into the institutions, they were issued a requisition form, and the hospital generally would take the things that they came in with. So most people would pack a suitcase and either commit themselves or be committed by someone else. They'd have the suitcase with them. The hospital generally would take that from them, and then the patients could go and purchase what they needed from the hospital themselves, because the hospital usually had particular clothing that the patients were to be wearing. In most cases, the women were wearing gray dresses, and the men were wearing striped pants and a shirt of some sort. So this is one of the patient's requisition forms. You can see that she got herself a sweater, a skirt, a blouse, and some cigarettes, all for $2. Next, please. This is one of the original newsletters that the state hospital put out. Almost every institution in Massachusetts had their own newsletter, typically created by patients. Obviously, this artwork is incredibly advanced, but could likely have been done by a patient. There were some incredibly talented people at Danvers State Hospital. You'll see some samples of patient artwork further along. But this one is dated 1975, and they would pass these out to everyone, and they would also be available to townsfolk, and also any of the related service providers that were coming and going from the hospital, and to all of the patients and their families, so that they could just kind of keep up with the activities of the hospital. This could have been things like who's employee of the month, what kind of activities are coming up. They did regular picnics and shows and things like that, and that would be in these newsletters. But this is a really incredibly well-preserved piece of paper from the state hospital. Next slide, please. These are probably two of my favorite pictures, just because I love the medical aspect of the history. The left-hand side is a hydrotherapy suite. So one of the most common treatments for people with mental illness was hydrotherapy of some sort. Generally, the theory was that if you were overworked, if you were anxious, if you were having a panic attack, that if they put them in a circulating bath of a certain temperature, it would kind of pummel the body and level out your temperature, and you would calm down. And that particular type of circulating bath was perfected at Danvers State Hospital. They call it the Westboro system. On the right is actually one of the surgical suites at Danvers State Hospital, probably, I'd say early 1930s, judging by the nurse's footwear. And you can just see how bright and clean and airy it was, which I think is very different from what our concept of what the state hospitals look like. But these were the standards that the hospitals typically upheld.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
This looks lovely, spa-like, but these were mandatory things. The water was ice cold, and you can't, you're covered up until you're back. You
Yeah.
can't do anything other than submit to this.
However, at the time that photo was taken, it would have been slightly different. The treatment would have been slightly different because it wouldn't have been a controlled treatment so much as an actual treatment. So they had actual time limits. You couldn't just be left in the tub. So further on down the road, hydrotherapy became a controlled treatment. And it was awful. And yes, the water was ice cold. Attendants didn't bother regulating the temperature anymore. It didn't matter. It was more important that this patient stopped screaming than that they actually got some benefit from it. These early pictures, you can see the nurse that's standing over by the gauges. Her only responsibility was to make sure she was regulating the temperature on every single one of those tubs and keeping time on how long those patients were left in the tubs. Later on, not so much. Those patients could sit in those tubs for hours. And sometimes without supervision. Notice how many nurses are in that picture. And later on, you'd be lucky if one was kind of popping her head in to make sure no one had drowned. Yes, sir?
Is there any indication, did it do any good?
At the time, yes. So if you think about the era that these pictures are from, when we talk about what was available for treatments, we are not in the era of psychopharmacologicals yet. There are no medications at that time. The only thing that was available was homeopathic natural medications and physical treatment. That is why we got to the point where we started toying around with psychosurgery, like lobotomy. Things like that worked for certain patients. Low-level patients who were experiencing things like chronic anxiety, panic attacks, mild depression. But once you got into working with patients who had more stubborn illnesses, especially when the incidences of schizophrenia started to increase, those tubs aren't going to work at all. And that's when we moved into, this is a general surgery that's in this picture, but we did start moving into experimenting with things like electroshock therapy, insulin shock therapy, once we had the drugs available. I'll explain that one later. These are, I believe, these are Richard Trask's. Yeah. Okay, next one. Okay, so this is the stuff of nightmares. This is where we kind of shift into what our modern day perception of the asylum is. These are images of, the top left is actually a lab where Dr. Charles Page, who was superintendent of the hospital twice, developed the first comprehensive pathology lab. He wanted to figure out what the roots of mental illness were, and he had a feeling those roots were biologic, that it was something in our brains, as opposed to the older theories that it was witchcraft or possession, or the ever lovely one, you had different colored humors in your body that were causing you to act a different way. Page was convinced that it was biological, it was in your brain, and he wanted to figure out where the connection was. So he would study the brains of people who had passed away in the hospitals and take a look at the differences between theirs and a typical brain to see if he could find that biological link. And his papers, you can actually still read online. There's a whole bunch of his research that is still published. You can look them on Amazon, believe it or not. And it's incredibly interesting. And in 1910, as a gift, all of his students took all of his writings, all of their research reports, bound them together into a book, and that is what you can still get your hands on. So, the right-hand side, this man right here in the glasses is Dr. Walter Freeman. He is the father of the transorbital ice pick lobotomy. Yes. He's best known for lobotomizing Rose Kennedy. He had gone and seen a presentation in Italy, and there was a doctor that had done a transorbital lobotomy, which means going in through your eye socket, which was the best and safest way to do it back then. The doctor in Italy did it with a wire. So you can see that one's a little thicker than it should be, but that top picture is a little closer to what the doctor in Italy was doing. The doctor in Italy took a very thin wire, went in very precisely into the frontal lobe of the patient, and disconnected some of the nerves. Your frontal lobe is responsible for all of your emotional reactions. And in the case of people who were mentally ill or unruly, that was a big reason for lobotomies, disconnecting those nerve endings essentially just stopped the frontal lobe from reacting and made people a lot quieter, a lot easier to deal with, and very often less depressed. However, when you start taking an ice pick, like about this long, and a whole lot thicker than that transorbital wire, and you're doing it without really truly knowing where you're headed in the brain, the way that Freeman used to do it is he would tap the ice pick in and he would ask the patient to sing their ABCs. And he would go and swish around until they couldn't say their ABCs any longer. So if anyone knows the story of Rose Kennedy, after she was lobotomized, she was incontinent, she couldn't feed herself, she was essentially a vegetable, and she had to be institutionalized for the rest of her life. The purpose of Rose being lobotomized at the time was simply because she was the unruly Kennedy.
She was just a female.
That's Rosemary.
Yes, yeah. She also was slightly less intelligent than the rest of her family, but when you think about the Kennedys, they almost all of them have genius IQs. So yes, she was slightly less intelligent, but she would not have been deemed disabled, or at the time what they would have said is mentally retarded. She didn't qualify for anything like that, but because she was different from the rest of her family, lobotomizing her seemed to be the best way to go, which it clearly backfired. What Freeman used to do as he was perfecting his practice, which he perfected at Danvers State Hospital, he had this brown station wagon, and he called it the lobotomobile. And he would go around offering his services, giving lobotomies out the back of his car. Now, that said, in some cases, for some patients, lobotomy worked beautifully. And as the ad said, the only side effect was a black eye. But that was when it was done properly, in a controlled environment, and for the right patient. And we still do lobotomies today. We do them with microsurgery. And only in extreme cases for patients for whom their chronic, debilitating depression does not respond to medication or therapy of any kind. It is the absolute last resort these days. At the time that Freeman was practicing, it was kind of the first line of defense. But at the time, we did the best we could with what we had. Now we look at it and we're going, wait a minute. Who thought this was a good idea? Same thing with electroshock therapy. In the early days when they started experimenting with electroshock therapy, the machines were so crude and rudimentary that even the person administering it would get shocked by the machine. But they had discovered that patients with schizophrenia never had epilepsy, and epileptic patients never had schizophrenia. They thought the link was the seizures. Electroshock therapy causes a grand mal seizure. So for a little while after electroshock therapy, those patients were a lot calmer. They could hold a conversation. They couldn't remember anything from 5 minutes ago. And in some cases, they lost a lot of their short-term memory and some of their long-term memory, but that was a side effect that people were willing to kind of negotiate with if it made people feel a little bit better for a little while. But then, of course, we get to the point where we start giving patients constant courses of electroshock therapy because we didn't know what else to do. Then came insulin shock. They also figured out they could induce seizures with an overdose of insulin. Not a great idea for the body. Not that electricity was a better idea, but insulin wasn't a great idea either. And then they had another drug, bless you, metrazole, that also created seizures in the patient. However, again, we still do electroshock therapy for patients for whom medication and talk therapy do not work. And these are patients for whom their depression is debilitating. And in most cases, the patients who are receiving either electroshock or something as extreme as the lobotomy, these are patients that otherwise would likely commit suicide. So the trade-off is we try something a little bit more extreme to see if those patients can have a little bit better quality of life. And then, yes, go ahead.
Who came up with the idea of a frontal lobotomy? I mean, since they knew precious little, I assume, about the brain.
Very little. They knew very little.
How did they even come up with the idea?
If I remember correctly, don't quote me on this, I'd have to look it up, but it had something to do with someone getting injured, getting a major injury in his frontal lobe. Huh? Yes, Phineas Gage. He got a railroad spike through his frontal lobe, and they noticed the complete personality shift. Yes. And so they were like, hey, let's give it a go. And so, of course, that then translates, because we're in spooky season now, it translates into the horror film vision that we have of lobotomies, which is 100% accurate. This is a still from session 9, which was filmed at Danvers, which obviously they took the fact that Friedman perfected lobotomy at Danvers and ran with it. But that image is exceptionally accurate. That is exactly what those ice picks looked like. That's what they used. It was a general run-of-the-mill ice pick. Hopefully it's not the ice pick that you have in your house right now.
After Freeman, when he started, he used his
own ice pick from his kitchen. Yeah, I hope he washed it first. So, you know, next slide. You'll see here, this is actually, after a while, they were trying to keep track of how many different treatments they were doing at Danvers and why. So you'll see that they have checked off psychosurgery, insulin shock therapy, and electroshock. Note the number of patients that were receiving electroshock therapy, and note the fact that it's more females than males. That was very common, and the populations of patients in the hospitals were more female than male. Mostly because women could be committed for any reason. Yep, absolutely. Postpartum depression was a huge one. PMS? Oh yeah, absolutely. I would get a Connor. Postpartum depression was a huge one. Husbands that were just done with their wives. They wanted out of their marriage and divorce was illegal, so what's next? Commit them to the asylum. Yes, ma'am?
Psychoanalysis doesn't have any knowledge. Is that done?
Yeah, so psychoanalysis was not very popular. So I have to assume that they were doing psychoanalysis on some level. I don't know, the record keeping doesn't look great here. They also didn't put a number for psychosurgery, so it makes you wonder just how many of those they did. But that's a really good question.
Well, I noticed the one down that says lack of sufficient staff and I'm next to psychoanalysis.
Yes, yes. So they probably just didn't have therapists at the time. And a lot of institutions went through those horrible staffing issues, so. And then I like lack of requisite facilities under electronarcosis, which I'm not even sure what electronarcosis is. I would have to look it up, but it sounds fun. But this is, it's very interesting to me just how free they were with the electroshock therapy.
Now, what year was this?
I don't think there was a year on this one. I think this is the one we have now. I'll have to look when I get home and see what the year is on it. Excited. So this is an old lab slip from Danvers And you'll see the one on the top is Thorazine. So once we got into the era of psychopharmaceuticals, the most commonly used drug was Thorazine, and it was nicknamed the chemical straitjacket. So essentially, once hospitals started to become overcrowded, and doctors began to realize that all you had to do was medicate the patients and you could fit more patients on the ward, and they'd be quieter, Thorazine became the go-to. However, what they didn't realize was that Thorazine had devastating long-term effects. It causes a condition called tardive dyskinesia, which looks a lot like Parkinson's. You get very strange facial tics and tremors until you can't function any longer. And they had no idea that this was happening, so they were using it as a widespread drug to control patients and to make it easier to have thousands of people in these hospitals. Believe it or not, Thorazine is still used today. I had a student at the age of 17 who this was what they call a PRN. It's as needed, so anytime she was feeling a little not so great, she could pop a Thorazine. And then couldn't figure out why she was shaking like a leaf. We figured it out. All right, next slide, please. These are just some of the forms that were left behind. You can see this one's just a request for information. This one's an escape report, which I thought was really great. I haven't yet found one that's filled out. But, you know, it's nice to have a blank in case you want to use it on a friend. Next, please. So, when we get into the era of psychopharmaceuticals, we're heading into about the 1950s. This photograph is late 1940s, early 1950s. This was taken, you can see, the cupola is still there, obviously, and the landscaping is pretty much the same as it is now. And what that entrance there is the main entrance to the administration building, which is now the main entrance to the condos and the apartments. Next, please. And that's one of my favorite photos. So here's some photos from the 1950s. If any of you have my Danvers book, you've probably seen these. But this was a nurse. Her name was Alberta, and she worked at the hospital in the 50s. And these are just some glamour shots that she was taking of herself around the hospital, like you do. But at that time, she would have been living on campus. All of the nurses and doctors lived on campus amongst the patients, some of them. And then there were also nurses' houses dotted along the edge. You can see there's a male tenants building here and female over here. There were employee homes, but some of them did live on the wards as well. And this collection of Alberta's photos, there's a ton of them. Because apparently she did that a lot. How she had the money to be developing pictures, I'll never know.
So there's more photographs of her on campus?
There's a ton. Yeah, I don't own them, but they're beautiful. Next slide, please. So these photos, you are the first ones to see these. These are stills from the filming of Home Before Dark, which was one of the first movies filmed at Danvers State Hospital. At least I have a picture of that. I swear to God, it'll be the last thing you do. So you can see that they were getting all the lights ready, and they filmed in the dead of winter. The very opening scene is the main character is driving up to the hospital to be committed through all of this snow in the middle of the night. The movie is well worth seeing. It was filmed in 1954, and the very beginning, they walk into the hospital, and I mean, it's just pristine. And you can get a really great image of what the hospital looked like at the time. Next slide. And this is another still from the movie, which I just thought was so cool. Probably a lot of cast and crew just gathered around, getting things going. But no one else besides you has ever seen these, so.
Actually, I remember when she worked in the film.
I remember you saying that. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, most of the nurses lived on campus. That is Grey Gables, one of the nurses' houses. That is rumored to have the door knocker from Judge Hathorne's mansion. However, it's since been demolished. We have no idea where the door knocker went. And this is another really beautiful, this is pre pre-1970, because it still has its cupola, probably about late 1930s, early 1940s. I love the ivy crawling up it, the vines and everything. Next one, please. Just some more paperwork. This was the move schedule as they started to, when they decided to close Danvers, what they did is they regionalized the hospital. So they created tiny regions within the hospital and then slowly started condensing and moving patients out into the community or into other facilities. Tewksbury was still open and fully operating at the time. So this is the move schedule for transporting patients over to Tewksbury. And obviously the employees get to come back. Next, please. This was one of the pamphlets released when they started to talk about moving psychiatric patients out into the community. When John F. Kennedy signed deinstitutionalization into law in the 1960s, there was a ghost of a plan of how it was going to be done, but it was not a very solid plan. But these pamphlets went out and kind of told people what to expect when it came to psychiatric patients living in group homes, in their neighborhoods, in their community, and how to best support that move. Great idea on paper, not so much in practice. So, once they started doing that and phasing down the hospital and pushing people out to the community, the hospital itself ended up sitting abandoned for quite some time. Next slide, please.
What year did they close?
1992. And these are some of the photographs. These were taken by John Gray, who runs the Danvers State Hospital website. And he got to spend a great amount of time in the hospital documenting it as it was abandoned. Next slide, please. And some more. The cupola on the left was, is that Archer's?
It might be, I
I
can't
think
tell.
it is. It's going after a truck.
Yeah,
So
that's it.
a local resident, John Archer, rescued one of the cupolas from the hospital and actually built it into his home. It is now part of his home. You literally walk out of his living room into the cupola of the state hospital. It's amazing. The walls of the cupola are doors from the patient rooms. He has the last remaining piece of tin ceiling from the hospital. He's preserved quite a bit of the hospital's history. It's pretty incredible. And you can see this is the start of things coming down at the hospital, unfortunately. Next slide, please. And this is the beginning of demolition when the hospital started to come down. And unfortunately, there were a number of grassroots efforts to save the hospital and save more than what we see now, because not a whole lot of it was retained when the condos were built, but unfortunately, those grassroots efforts didn't prevail. Next slide, please. And you can see this is what they saved for the main building of the condos. Okay, next slide. So, in the meantime, Danvers has kind of cemented its place in pop culture history. This is a still from Session 9. Probably the best known movie that was ever filmed at Danvers, just because it was fairly recent. Probably the worst movie I've ever seen. I like to watch it on mute personally, just so I can watch the building. Not a great plot, but this is kind of more emblematic of the vision that we have of Danvers State Hospital today. As well, Danvers was the model for, way back in the day, H.P. Lovecraft's Arkham Asylum, which eventually morphed into Arkham Asylum of Batman lore. So Danvers has always had a spot in pop culture history, and of course, I'm sure everybody in the local towns has been dared to go into the buildings at one time or another when they're still standing as a rite of passage. Next slide, please. But it's also inspired a great deal of art. In the middle, the very large piece actually is in John Archer's home, and that was painted by Michael Ramser, who has a number of books out that are collections of his artwork and reflections of his time going around the campus at Danvers. This is the one in the lower right is also from Ramser's book, but the one in the upper left is actually patient art that has survived.
Where did that come
I'm not sure. But yeah, that's an example of some patient art. And if you watch session 9, you'll see there's also a painting of a giant swan in one of the hydrotherapy rooms that is also patient art. The other stuff in session 9 that they say is patient art, it's not. That was for the movie. Next slide, please. In session 9, if you watch carefully, they are in a cemetery where you will see the grave markers that are on the left. When the cemetery was memorialized in the 1990s, they popped out all of the grave markers that had numbers on them, replaced them with the patient's names and their approximate dates of birth and death. However, in session 9, the grave markers that you see are not real, they're actually made of styrofoam, because they decided that the cemetery was too far away, so they created their own cemetery for the movie. I don't know.
What is a cemetery down
There are 2. So when you're on the main campus, if you're staring at the condos, one cemetery is behind you. There's a little hill with a little drive that goes behind some of the new housing. And that's the Highlands Cemetery, because it's up on the hill. And then if you head out towards the farmland, where the Middleton Farm Colony used to be, there's also a DYS, Department of Youth Services facility out there. The Lowlands Cemetery is out there. The Lowlands Cemetery still has those markers.
The DYS, is that what Hogan used to be?
Hogan is still a Department of Developmental Services program. The DYS facility is not brand new, but yeah, I'm not sure.
Did they just have numbers, because
Yes,
people were sort of dropped off and
Yes.
nobody knew who they were?
exactly. So state institutions, all state institutions across Massachusetts and largely across the United States have numbered markers, or in some cases, no markers at all. In fact, the Danvers Cemetery, though very well memorialized, they didn't have records that spanned from, I think, 1920 to 1935, so there's some that are missing that are likely buried in between and just haven't been located yet. Belchertown State School, we're fairly certain, there was a fence put up at one time when they memorialized the cemetery, but we're fairly certain there are still bodies outside of the fence. Same thing with Fernald State School, we know that there's bodies buried on the campus, we just don't know where. And that's a very common thing for state institutions, unfortunately. Yes, sir.
My great-grandfather was buried here. He was exhumed and moved to Gloucester.
Yeah.
But I know that these numbers were there because the hospital, and I'm not saying I know this, I know you know more than this, but I think that the idea was that the hospital did not want to divulge the name of the patients. And so those numbers are actually the patient number. It's the number you need in order to get the record.
In most cases, yes, that is the case. Usually the numbers did correspond to a patient file. In the early days, so you'll see this one's 8, it did not. It was just the number. If they were unclaimed by a family member, you were numbered and that was it.
After death, were they taken to the state hospital? Was there ever autopsies or physicians or anything? Or you just died and stayed off the death?
You were just buried. Not until they started developing pathology labs did they start looking at that kind of thing. And even then it wasn't an autopsy so much as a pathology investigation. And there were some, like Danvers State Hospital, didn't have markers of any kind. And then eventually when the state hospital became a prison, the prison continued to use the state hospital burying grounds to bury prisoners who weren't claimed. So it's very difficult to figure out who's who in that particular cemetery. Same thing that we're going through in Westboro, because the state hospital patients were buried in the town cemetery with the babies and the paupers, so we don't know who's state hospital, and who was simply unclaimed poor, is how they used to term it. So cemeteries are a very difficult part of figuring out the history of state hospitals. Yes?
Sorry, to go back, you said the swan painting in the movie was a real art from a patient. What happened to that painting? Was that lost when they...
They just went through and demolished. Yeah, unfortunately, there was no stopping and thinking about that, unfortunately. Unless an explorer went through and grabbed stuff, nothing survived. It just all got turned under. It's happened at every single one of the institutions that's been demolished. I watched them take the autopsy table at Northampton State Hospital, tip it into the tunnel, and then just crush the tunnel on top of it. That was how they disposed of things. It was not fun for the historians to watch that. restored what looks like the original cupola on the top of the administration building. They did a really nice job. But this is the facade of what's left. And that's one of my favorite pictures of the condos themselves. And next slide. And last but not least, since the last time that I did this presentation forever ago, we have spent the last couple of years working on some very important legislation. I was talking about it a little bit earlier. There are a lot of barriers to sharing the history of institutions. One of those barriers is the Massachusetts government and the bureaucracy behind it. Most people who want to gain access to the records of a loved one or want information about this kind of thing, they either have to find me, or if they want access to records, they have to go through a bunch of legal hoops in order to get it. So we won one victory recently in that we were able to create a commission on state institutions. The purpose of the commission is we have until 2025 to figure out how best to memorialize places like Danvers, and how best to create opportunities for public education. I'm only one person, I can only do these events so often, but there are many of us who do this, but it's still not enough. There's so much out there, and so little state support, and now we have it. We have support from both the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Developmental Services to create this commission and to figure out how best to create all of these public opportunities to keep the history of institutions and those who lived and worked in them alive. However, we still have one more hurdle to get over. And this is something that, if you are interested, we are always looking for support. A few times now we have tried to put legislation forth that would allow easier access to records. And we are proposing records that are 90 years old or more be made readily available to the public, and that a copy be provided to the state archives so they're available for research. Then later we'll work on the newer records for families that want to access newer records. However, right now, one hurdle at a time, but we will be presenting that piece of legislation again in the next section. We already got one win, we're going to sit on it for a little while, and then we'll go for the next win. But if you are interested in supporting any of these endeavors, if you're interested in the commission and what it's going to be doing, or if you're interested in supporting the records bill, please let me know. I will give you as much information as humanly possible. And we'll be moving forward on creating more programs like this and more sustainable programming as we move forward in creating our museum in Belchertown. We'd like to support other parts of the state in creating museums in their areas too, so we can create a network. We would be the first state to do that. There is no other state right now in New England that has a brick and mortar museum to these institutions, even though New England had the most institutions per capita at one point. So if you're interested in any of that, please let me know. And that is it for my slides. And if you haven't gotten a chance to look already, my friend Ethan kindly brought a Danvers State Hospital straight jacket, if you'd like to take a look at that. This is a nurse's case from the 40s, from the 1940s. And this is from one of the original grassroots efforts to keep the state hospital standing. Questions? Yes?
You mentioned that this was the fourth.
Yes.
What's left of the other institutions?
So Northampton has one building left. It is still the Department of Mental Health Western Region offices. It was built in the 1950s, so it's none of the original buildings. They did retain one semi-older building as part of their apartments, but other than that, Northampton went down pretty quick. But Northampton had already kind of started demolishing itself pretty quickly. Worcester, there is nothing left except for the Hooper Turret, which is a cool round building that was emblematic of the hospitals in Worcester because the General Hospital had those turrets also. And then they have the clock tower monument that you can see from 290. Let's see, Taunton. Taunton, I'm not sure if any of the original buildings exist. For a little while, they were being used by Department of Youth Services programming. Westboro State Hospital, there's two buildings left that are Department of Youth Services. Tewksbury is still in operation, but it does have a few abandoned buildings on the campus that they're not using. Foxborough is now condos, as is Danvers, obviously. Boston Psychopathic is still operating, but in a very different way. Metropolitan State Hospital has one original building, but it's a disaster. The rest of it is condos. McLean Hospital is still open and operating fully. They use all of their buildings now. So the one that burned down, we'll talk about that. And I'm trying to think. There's more. I just can't think of them all off the top of my head.
Belchertown.
So Belchertown, we have 10 buildings left. We are saving 1, 2, 3. Oh God, I can't keep track of it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we just have a couple of dorms that are coming down soon-ish. We'll see. I don't know. I tried to talk to my developer to save the door, and he said no. But I tried. I put up a good fight, I promise. But the administration building will be open soon. We're going to do tours first, if anyone wants to do tours. Investigations, if it's really, really quiet. Paranormal investigations, as long as you keep on the super down low. The town hates that stuff. Yes, ma'am?
How much is known about what happened to the patients after deinstitutionalization? Has that been followed?
So it was followed very closely within the first year or two by social workers. After that, not so much. What we do know are anecdotal things like in the first couple of years after Danvers State Hospital closed, there were over 100 arrests of patients trying to get back in because they weren't prepared for life in group homes. There were a number of group home fires in Northampton specifically. Staff weren't equipped to take care of the residents who were coming out. It's why Northampton has such a high homeless population. Most towns where you have a facility like that that has closed down, you will see a higher than average homeless population, and the majority of them have mental health issues. Gardner State Hospital, when they closed down, Winchendon grabbed their overflow. That town it's almost all group homes, and you'll see folks walking around, and if you stop them and ask them, they will tell you, it's not Gardner. Same thing with Northampton. That was very typical, bless you, after the hospitals closed. Most of the data that we have now is from group home failures. So more of what we have is private agency data, and it's not great. Not encouraging.
What amount of patients that when Danvers closed, once you closed?
What's what?
Oh,
I don't think very many because Hogan was a DDS facility, so they were slightly different. Yes, ma'am.
So you said, or you implied at the very beginning, patients received the best service in the right time, but at some point,
Yes.
the attitude of the staff changed?
No. Funding changed.
Okay.
Funding changed. The first wave was funding, and that was around World War II, when we had these waves of soldiers coming back, first of all, that needed care. We also had the tuberculosis epidemics that were sweeping through. The numbers of people in institutions just skyrocketed, and the funding didn't keep up because our money was going to the war effort. Shortly after that was the advent of psychopharmacological drugs. And that was the huge turning point when they said, all right, we can pack these places to the gills, we can give them drugs, and then we no longer have to pay for talk therapy, we no longer have to worry about going out and working on a farm, we don't have to worry about OT and PT, they're going to sleep all day, it'll be fine. And the more people they could pack in, the more money they were making, the better it was. But the money wasn't coming back to the patients. And that's when we end up with that whole snake pit view, and it just kind of careened from there.
So how many patients was the hospital designed for versus how many did they put in there?
I don't remember off the top of my head, bless you. I'll look it up in my book right after. After researching asylums and state schools for 20 years, I've lost track of the numbers at this point.
It was 400. It was
450 originally, and up around something like, yeah, a few thousand when they closed. Yeah, I saw a hand.
No, I was thinking I had just read something so long ago, so I'm not sure. I thought I had read somewhere it was intended for like 600 to 800, and it became 2,400.
I'll double check. I know it's in my book.
That's consistent with the tour I had in Tewksbury. They said there was it peaked at about 2,000.
Yeah, that's about average for most of the places. Unless you get down south, then you're looking for like 10 or 11,000. Yes.
Where or how were the records saved after the demo of the institution?
So originally, when the institutions closed, the records were supposed to have been transferred to other institutions. I would say maybe 60% of those records got transferred. A lot got left behind. There's been a lot of news reports lately of kids breaking into these places and finding records left behind. That is a very common occurrence. When I first started studying Belchertown, there were just records everywhere. And of course, me being a mandated reporter, I used to take them to work and shred them because I didn't want anybody getting them. But I mean, these were things like lab slips and social security cards, things that never should have been left behind. By and large, DMH still holds these records, unless they're in private hands, which a lot of them are. So, is that it? Oh gosh, too many hands. Yes.
I know tonight is about Danvers, but I'm just curious. Have you ever been to Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum
I
in
have
West
not.
Virginia?
I am not. So I'm a full-time director of special education, so I spend a lot of my time right here in Massachusetts.
Because it's one of the largest FERC rides.
Yeah, and it's absolutely beautiful. That
Yes.
and Fergus Falls, I could easily live in one or both of them. Yes, sir.
Comment on the records. When I was a selectman back in the 90s, we would give a tour of the building after it closed before they were going to demolish it for condos.
Yep.
And the records were approximately 3 inches deep all over the floors.
Yeah. Yeah.
Disgusting.
That's the reality. I will say the state had they had a kind of a just lock the doors and go kind of attitude. It is disgusting, and they do pop up on eBay frequently. You'll see them at antique shows, especially here in Danvers when they do, or in Salem rather, when they have the some like the oddities marts and things like that. You'll see them. It happens a lot, and you'll see them from all of the institutions. I spend a lot of time. Now that I'm opening a museum, I haunt eBay, no pun intended. Spend a lot of time on eBay looking for things that belong in the museum, and it's amazing how far afield things have gotten. I've gotten key tags for Belchertown State School from the UK. It's amazing how far these things travel when they belong here in Massachusetts. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just want to mention, as far as the movie, you said Home Before Dark is one of them. I wasn't able to find that one. Section 9 you can find easily.
Yeah, Home Before Dark is tough to find.
But there's also the Nobody's Child with Sally Field plays movie
Yes.
at Walmart.
Yeah.
And that was a pretty good movie, and that we can get at the library.
I completely forgot about that one. Nobody's Child. It's about Marie Walter. That was a very, very well done film.
You mentioned that a lot of them a lot of these artifacts make their way out of state. I found a employee index and it came all the way from Paris.
Yep. It's amazing how far this stuff travels and who has it. It blows my mind. You mentioned it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the records, I want to talk to you about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things I stumbled on, I was in Mass Archives, and I found a collection in Mass Archives for what they called the public institution record, and it included mental hospitals,
Yes.
public hospitals, reform schools, things like that, and there were selected hospitals in which they had certain registers available for you to look at. Danvers is one of them. And I found my great-grandfather's name and his number and his diagnosis at the time of entry. And then I went back to the desk to say, gee, I like that number. And his face went from, they're usually so helpful and nice, his face went from smile to frown.
Yeah.
And he just walked away from me, and it took me a day and a half before I could get somebody to explain to me that I couldn't see those records.
Yeah.
But there is records.
But the register is
There's some
there,
records
yeah.
at the Mass Archives for some of these institutions,
Yeah.
just minimal ones.
Yeah, and one of the first steps that we'll have to go through is we'll have to meet with the judge to find out how certain records can be released and what has to be redacted from them, what can be available, what groups they can be available to. It's not going to be an easy process, and that all comes out of the HIPAA laws, which are absolutely 100% necessary. But when we're talking about historical data that is important to education and furthering history, we've got to start thinking about it a little differently.
And family members, too.
And family members,
I mean,
because
family
it's
members
difficult.
can't get to it either.
No, absolutely.
I
feel incredibly fortunate.
Yes. Yes, that is absolutely, that's probably the best.
My grandmother, who died here in 1940, I wrote to Tewksbury and asked for the records. And my brother and I had to sign an affidavit saying we were the last living relatives for more than 60 years. And they sent me this whole big thick packet with a
And that is not typical.
her
Not
initial
typical at all.
interview, her autopsies in there, every meeting with the doctors.
I was told I had to go to probate.
Like, these were two programs.
Yeah, you have to get it, in most cases, you have to get a judge's order, and it's pretty intensive.
Is there ever an opportunity to do tours on the grounds? I know that there's condos now, but it's such a large area. Is there ever?
I live up there.
Yeah.
I don't live in the, because actually they're apartments.
Yes,
The condos are next door.
yeah,
You can walk through the building, but it's just an apartment complex.
yeah. I mean, there's not a whole lot to
Right,
it,
you can
unless,
go down the hill to the cemeteries.
Mhm.
yeah,
And on the top of the hill, there's like a little semicircle of granite, and they have some of these, I don't know what they call these, sort of these angled pedestals, and they have pictures
yeah.
of what some of the pictures you have, where the garden is, and some
Yeah.
pictures of staff.
Some of the pictures came from the same sources. I worked on the committee that put them on.
But you're not gonna know what it is if you walk around. It
Yeah.
just looks like a big brick building.
Mm.
It could be like an old library or an old city hall.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to tell what it was. Yes, ma'am.
When is, why was the hospital closed?
So, by the time the 1990s came around, so deinstitutionalization, though it started in the 60s, was meant to be a process over time. So they recognized that it was going to take close to 30 to 40 years to close all of the large-scale institutions down, because they also had to build the community treatment infrastructure at the same time, because it didn't exist yet. They had to build group homes, they had to build community mental health treatment facilities. So Danvers, because they were able to phase it down the way they did, they phased down within the main building first, then they used the Bonner building and Gray Gables, and they just kind of like, they were able to last longer and hold patients longer, but there were also so many difficulties finding placements for patients that it took longer. Northampton was the same thing, they didn't close until 92. Westboro didn't close until 2010. So it depended on the need versus the services that were available.
Sorry, you all were talking about tunnel?
Yeah, yes, all state institutions had tunnels. The asylums had large walkable tunnels. In fact, I had a friend whose parents worked at Northampton State Hospital. Her mom used to ride her bike from the nurse's dorm through the tunnels into the main Kirkbride, because the tunnels were so huge. And it was so that in New England especially, the patients didn't have to go out into the snow in order to get from one place to another on the campus. And also, usually the morgue and the pathology lab were down in the tunnels. There was storage. I know Northampton was weird. The morgue was here and there was a gym here. So you had to walk by the morgue, which I never understood. But it also made it easy to serve food if you were going out to different parts of the campus, so that you could just do it quickly and they could wheel the carts without having to go outside, things like that.
Are they all closed?
Yes, yeah, the tunnels are all gone. And then the state schools had largely, their tunnels were more utility tunnels. The electrical was all underground and so was the heat.
Unfortunately, some patients went down there and killed themselves in some cases.
Yeah, tunnels were definitely the less supervised areas of the hospitals, very much so.
Any other questions for Catherine?
I just have one more question about the tunnels. When you said that the patients were able to walk freely, so did they go down there?
I don't know if the tunnels were included in that. It's not mentioned in any of the annual reports. They just talked about the wards themselves being unlocked and that patients could move freely throughout the wards, into the administration building, cafeteria, things like that. The tunnels aren't mentioned.
Did that include the outer wings?
I would say probably not. The outer wings, just because those were the most violent patients, likely those themselves were locked. I do have copies of my book, if anyone would like it, if you don't have it already.
Oh, thank you so much, Catherine.